April 4th, 1945. American GIs pushed through the gates of Ohrdruf, a place most had never heard of, in a war they thought they understood. They were wrong. What they found stopped them cold. Emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood. The smell, unbearable, inescapable. Evidence of cruelty so systematic it defied belief. These weren't hardened generals. They were 19-year-old kids from small towns across America, and they were seeing evil in its purest form. When Eisenhower arrived 3 days later, his face went pale. He didn't look away. Instead, he made a decision that would echo through history. Photograph everything. Bring the press. Bring witnesses. Make sure the world sees this. Because he understood. If we don't face this now, if we don't document every horrific detail, someone will deny it ever happened. This is the story of liberation, told through American eyes. On April 4th, 1945, American soldiers from the 4th Armored Division and 89th Infantry Division entered Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald. They were the first U.S. troops to confront the full scope of Nazi crimes. What they discovered, emaciated corpses, mass graves, and instruments of torture, would shatter any remaining illusions. The stench reached them before the gates. General Eisenhower, upon seeing Ohrdruf, insisted that the world must see this evidence. He ordered extensive photography and called for senior officials and the press to witness it. This visceral shock began a systematic drive to document the machinery of murder, evidence that would anchor war crimes trials and expose earlier warnings left unmet. By late 1942, a grim picture was emerging through Allied intelligence channels. Detailed reports described a campaign of systematic extermination far beyond the known brutality of the Nazi regime. In August of that year, a crucial dispatch arrived from Geneva. Gerhard Riegner, head of the World Jewish Congress office, sent a telegram to American and British diplomatic contacts. His information, sourced from a German industrialist with access to high-level SS communications, contained a stark warning. It stated that Hitler intended to deport and exterminate between 3.5 and 4 million Jews in a single coordinated operation in Eastern Europe. The method was to be poison gas. This was one of the first concrete alerts describing the mechanics of the final solution, including the use of hydrocyanic acid, details that would later be confirmed in the ruins of the killing centers. Yet these detailed warnings were met with a mixture of skepticism and strategic calculation. The sheer scale of the alleged atrocity led some officials to dismiss the reports as improbable exaggerations. Within the broader context of a global war, the systematic murder of civilians was often deemed a secondary intelligence priority compared to military movements and industrial targets. The bureaucracy moved slowly, weighed down by the immense demands of the war effort. A formal Allied response emerged on December 17, 1942. 11 nations, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, issued a joint declaration condemning the Nazi regime's bestial policy of cold-blooded extermination. The statement acknowledged numerous reports of Jews being removed to Eastern Europe under conditions of appalling horror and brutality, and noted that none of those taken away are ever heard of again. It identified Poland as the principal Nazi slaughterhouse. At that moment, many extermination facilities, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, were in operation, but public Allied documents did not name them. Auschwitz-Birkenau's killing capacity was expanding and would accelerate in 1943. The declaration reflected what could be verified then. It was a statement of condemnation, not a blueprint for action. Behind the scenes, policy debates were mired in constraints. The discussion often centered on immigration quotas and the logistical feasibility of military intervention. Requests to bomb the rail lines leading to Auschwitz or the gas chambers themselves were repeatedly rejected by the War Department. Assistant Secretary of War John J. McCloy dismissed such proposals as impracticable, arguing they would divert essential air power from what were deemed decisive military operations. The efficacy of such bombings was also questioned, creating a rationale for inaction. Internal government memos reveal a clear tension. On one side, figures like John W. Paley of the War Refugee Board and Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, Jr. pushed for more assertive intervention. They argued for the moral imperative to save lives. On the other, a powerful inertia prevailed, fueled by a focus on total military victory, underlying anti-Semitism, restrictive immigration policy, and concerns about post-war relations with Germany. The United States issued far fewer visas than its quotas allowed during this period. The consequence was a widening gap between knowledge and action. The intelligence that reached Washington and London, names of methods, estimates of scale, the planned use of gas, matched the physical evidence soldiers would later find. As Allied armies refocused on penetrating the German interior in early 1945, their orders prioritized battlefield objectives. The next encounter with this truth would not arrive in a briefing room. It would be stumbled upon unexpectedly on the road. The road to Ohrdruf began along an axis of advance that was supposed to be routine. As American forces pushed deeper into Germany in the early months of 1945, their operational focus remained squarely on military objectives. They anticipated fortified defenses, counterattacks from elite units, and fierce resistance in the German heartland. The tactical briefings mentioned labor camps, but these references framed them as installations contributing to the Nazi war effort. The intelligence assessments failed to grasp the true nature of these facilities as centers of systematic extermination. The scale of the atrocities was underestimated, categorized as a secondary concern to winning the ground war. The soldiers of the 4th Armored Division, part of General Patton's 3rd Army, advanced eastward through the region of Thuringia. Their immediate objective was the city of Gotha. Their advance led them not to a battlefield, but to the gates of Ohrdruf. This subcamp of the larger Buchenwald complex was an unplanned discovery. Established to support the construction of underground facilities for a proposed communications center, Ohrdruf sat where labor, transport links, and concealment converged. The soldiers arrived expecting to engage enemy forces or capture a strategic position. Instead, they entered a scene that existed completely outside the boundaries of their military training. They found emaciated corpses, mass graves, and evidence of systematic murder. Approximately 500 survivors remained, a fraction of the camp's population after hurried evacuations and executions in the days before liberation. The contrast between their expectations and the reality they encountered was absolute. Their mission shifted in an instant. The initial reports from officers on the ground traveled up the chain of command with unprecedented urgency. The nature of the discovery demanded a response far beyond standard military procedure. The High Command recognized that this was not a localized atrocity, but evidence of a centrally organized policy of genocide. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's decision to visit Ohrdruf personally on April 12, 1945, alongside Generals George Patton and Omar Bradley, signaled a critical shift in operational priorities. This was no longer just about defeating an enemy army. It was about bearing witness to a crime against humanity. To prevent denial, leadership would have to see it for themselves and then act to ensure others could not look away. Eisenhower's inspection began with a deliberate decision to see Ohrdruf firsthand. On April 12, 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower arrived at the camp with Generals Omar Bradley and George S. Patton. The 3 senior commanders walked through the compound, confronting the evidence left by fleeing SS guards. They entered barracks, where the dead lay stacked among the living, the corpses emaciated and frozen in their final moments. Outside, they observed the charred remains of prisoners who had been set ablaze on a railroad track in a hasty, incomplete attempt to destroy evidence. They encountered instruments of torture and saw the physical ruin caused by prolonged starvation. General Patton reportedly became physically ill from the shock of what he saw. Eisenhower's reaction was immediate and systematic. He understood that the sheer horror could later be dismissed as exaggeration by those seeking to rewrite events. To counter this, he issued a decisive order. Every available American unit in the area, particularly those not on the front lines, was to be brought to Ohrdruf. He insisted that soldiers see the camp for themselves. He believed that first-hand exposure was necessary for his men to fully comprehend the nature of the enemy they were fighting. It was a strategic move to create an army of witnesses. Simultaneously, Eisenhower mandated an unprecedented level of documentation. He directed Army Signal Corps photographers and journalists to capture every detail. Their task was to produce an irrefutable visual record of the atrocities, piles of corpses, the conditions of the survivors, the implements of murder. He further requested that members of Congress and newspaper editors be flown in to view the camps, broadening the circle of credible witnesses beyond the military. This was a comprehensive witness strategy aimed at preventing future propaganda from taking hold. In a cable to Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall on April 15th, Eisenhower explained the intent behind his visit. He wrote, "The things I saw beggar description." He added, "The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick." He stated plainly that he went in order to be able to give first-hand testimony should any attempt be made to dismiss the reports as propaganda. His inspection was not only a moral act, it was an evidentiary strategy. This visit marked a turning point in Allied field practice. Senior leadership transitioned from operational focus to custodianship of proof. Eisenhower's insistence on direct witnessing and systematic documentation became the template for subsequent camp liberations. From that point, the discovery of a concentration camp triggered a coordinated process. Bring soldiers and officials to see, record everything, confront local populations, and preserve the sites as crime scenes for future accountability. The machinery of documentation had been set in motion. Within days, it would be applied on a larger scale. Just days after the discovery of Ohrdruf, the 6th Armored Division entered the main camp at Buchenwald on April 11, 1945. The scale of the horror they uncovered eclipsed anything encountered before. The soldiers found over 21,000 survivors in a state of extreme emaciation, many clinging to life amidst thousands of unburied dead. The camp's geography itself told a story of systematic killing. Mass graves were not simple pits, but layered structures of bodies. Many of the corpses bore the distinct marks of execution, revealing a process far removed from the random casualties of war. Inside the wire, order had not entirely collapsed. The International Camp Committee, an underground prisoner organization, had prepared for the moment of liberation and seized control of internal security as the SS fled. They posted guards, protected the weakest inmates, and stabilized the camp until American troops arrived. Their actions helped prevent further chaos and preserved records that would become part of the evidentiary record. The organization of Buchenwald was comprehensive. It was a large, established facility with barracks, administrative buildings, and industrial-grade crematoria. These ovens were not small-scale incinerators, but furnaces built for industrial throughput, capable of burning hundreds of bodies every day. The existence of such infrastructure indicated a long-term, bureaucratic operation. This was not a temporary, punitive measure. It was a permanent institution designed for sustained extermination and exploitation. The survivors' testimonies provided the narrative for the physical evidence. They described deaths resulting from multiple, overlapping causes. Prisoners succumbed to starvation rations, to diseases like typhus in the overcrowded barracks, or were worked to death in nearby forced labor sites. Others fell victim to brutal medical experiments conducted by camp physicians. These accounts detailed a regime of calculated dehumanization where death was an expected and managed outcome. The medical crisis that greeted the liberators was overwhelming. Army medics, trained for combat injuries, were now faced with a massive humanitarian catastrophe. Thousands of survivors required immediate care, but many were in such an advanced state of physiological collapse that standard treatments were ineffective. The situation was compounded by outbreaks of typhus and dysentery, which necessitated immediate quarantine measures to prevent further loss of life. Triage became a heartbreaking exercise in prioritizing the most critically ill, stretching the military's medical resources far beyond their intended capacity. In response to the widespread claims of ignorance from local German civilians, U.S. troops implemented a policy of forced confrontation. Approximately 1,000 residents of nearby Weimar were marched under guard through the camp. They were made to witness the piles of corpses, the emaciated survivors, and the infrastructure of the crematoria. Soon after, the mayor and his wife left a note, "We did not know, but we knew," before taking their own lives. The message captured the moral dissonance that the tour forced into the open. The sheer efficiency of the killing process at Buchenwald made it a potent symbol. The camp's meticulous records and specialized infrastructure demonstrated that the genocide was not an act of chaos, but a cold, industrial operation. For the soldiers, this evidence demanded comparison. Another camp would test the same questions about design, capacity, and intent. Dachau's killing machinery came into view on April 29, 1945, as American units fought through the last defenses. Soldiers from the 42nd and 45th Infantry Divisions, with tanks from the 20th Armored Division's 27th Tank Battalion, met sharp resistance from remaining SS guards. The camp was not fully abandoned. Just outside its walls, they made a grim discovery that signaled the nature of what was to follow. A long train of boxcars standing idle on the tracks. Inside were hundreds of corpses, a silent testament to a final, desperate transport of prisoners. The death train was a brutal preface to what waited inside. Once the perimeter was secured and the gates opened, the soldiers confronted a camp built for terror and attrition. They found survivors in advanced starvation and disease. They found the crematorium area. They also found a gas chamber in Barrack X, built and presented in a way associated with shower deception. But here is the crucial historical clarification. There is no credible evidence that Dachau's gas chamber was used to murder human beings. Dachau's death toll came overwhelmingly through shootings, torture, starvation, disease, brutal labor, and lethal transfers, including deportations to the Hartheim Killing Center, where thousands of Dachau prisoners were murdered. This distinction matters for credibility. Dachau was not Auschwitz, but it was still a machine of forced labor, terror, and death by attrition, supported by paperwork, routines, and violence. Beyond the structures, the paperwork told its own story. Soldiers seized meticulous death records kept by the SS administration, ledgers and forms that reduced lives to entries and totals. These were not haphazard logs, but systematic accounts that tracked causes, dates, and numbers. The bureaucracy pointed to a centralized, calculated program governed by routine. The condition of the survivors presented an immediate crisis. Thousands were in advanced stages of malnutrition and disease. Army medical teams moved quickly to feed, disinfect, and stabilize those they could, but the numbers overwhelmed available resources. Despite urgent care, the legacy of prolonged starvation and infection proved lethal. Out of around 10,000 patients admitted after liberation, over 1,500 died, most within the first 2 weeks. Bodies had simply been pushed beyond recovery. The impact on the liberators was severe. Some American soldiers, faced with the death train, the gas chambers, and the corpses in the ovens, lost composure and retaliated against captured SS guards. Commanders issued disciplinary measures and reasserted control, insisting that the primary tasks remained securing the site, documenting evidence, and caring for survivors. The anger was real, but so was the duty to bear witness. What was gathered at Dachau, photographs of the gas chambers and crematoria, captured records and testimony surrounding the death train, formed a durable evidentiary core. It established the machinery's design, capacity, and intent with clinical clarity. As the guns fell silent, a different kind of struggle took hold, one measured not in territory but in lives that might still be saved. The liberation of the camps did not end the emergency. It confronted U.S. Army medics with one of their greatest challenges. They faced thousands of survivors in critical condition, their bodies ravaged by years of systematic starvation and rampant disease. The scenes that greeted the medical corps were a complex humanitarian crisis layered on top of the military victory. Outbreaks of typhus and dysentery swept through the overcrowded barracks, posing a lethal threat to the weakened survivors and the soldiers themselves. The first order of business was often the immediate implementation of strict quarantine measures to contain the spread of contagion. This was a medical battlefield as urgent as any combat operation. Standard military triage protocols designed for wounded soldiers were immediately applied but proved inadequate. Resources were stretched to the breaking point. Medics had to make agonizing decisions, prioritizing those closest to death while knowing that many others would perish before they could receive help. The sheer number of patients completely overwhelmed the standard capacity of a field army's medical services. At Mauthausen alone, they had to hospitalize approximately 5,000 people with diseases spanning nearly every conceivable condition. This was not a temporary overflow. It was a systemic collapse of human physiology on a massive scale. Medical teams were forced to improvise with remarkable speed. They established field hospitals using any available space, often repurposing captured German medical supplies to supplement their own dwindling stocks. Their mission was to provide the most fundamental care. As Lieutenant Marie Knowles-Ellifritz detailed, this meant providing a tent to keep the patient dry, an air mattress to give them a place to lie down, a blanket to help them keep warm, pajamas to give them some dignity, a small amount of food to nourish them, and plasma to preserve the remaining life and begin them on a road back to living. These basics represented a radical departure from the absolute deprivation of the camps and became the baseline for survival. Nurses and doctors worked around the clock, operating under immense physical and psychological strain. They were not only treating unprecedented medical conditions, but also bearing witness to the profound human suffering that had caused them. The ethical dilemmas were constant. Decisions on how to allocate limited plasma, antibiotics, and food highlighted the brutal arithmetic of mass casualty care when resources were insufficient for the need. Every choice carried immense weight. This massive medical response marked a critical pivot in the U.S. Army's role. The soldiers transitioned from combatants to caregivers. Their efforts constituted the first optional relief operations. Footage from Dachau's liberation vividly depicts this immediate shift, showing soldiers directly involved in feeding survivors and conducting mass disinfection. These actions were vital for immediate survival, addressing the essential needs for hygiene and nourishment. The medical crisis revealed a deeper truth about the Nazi system. The survivors were not merely underfed, their bodies were systematically broken. Rehabilitation would be long and fraught with peril. Even an act as basic as giving food carried risk, requiring new protocols and careful calculation. The next challenge lay in understanding why care had to begin slowly and how even kindness could turn deadly if delivered too quickly. The act of feeding the starving prisoners, a fundamental gesture of compassion, presented a grave medical paradox. Survivors' metabolisms were so profoundly damaged by prolonged starvation that the sudden introduction of normal, nutrient-dense food could trigger fatal physiological shock. Years of extreme caloric deprivation had forced their bodies to consume their own muscle and organ tissue for energy. This adaptive state left them unable to safely process a sudden influx of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Medics were forced to implement a cautious strategy of gradual refeeding. They used diluted formulas specifically designed to avoid overloading the survivors' fragile systems. Standard army rations, canned goods, or rich foods like chocolate donated by well-meaning soldiers were potentially lethal. Hannah Fiske recalled that newly freed prisoners who ate such sweets were falling like flies, a blunt testament to the dangers faced in those first hours. The initial medical response was a learning process marked by tragic errors. In the first days after liberation, before the syndrome was fully understood, survivors who consumed regular food sometimes died from sudden cardiac failure or acute electrolyte imbalance. Their bodies, desperately lacking essential minerals like phosphate, potassium, and magnesium, could not handle the metabolic demands of processing nutrients. The heart, weakened by starvation, would simply stop. The nutritional science of the time had no precedent for managing such extreme and widespread malnutrition on this scale. Doctors were effectively writing the medical protocol in real time. They developed specialized diets based on a slow, deliberate increase in calorie intake. These diets often began with fluids like diluted milk or broth, administered in small, frequent portions. The goal was to gently restart the metabolic engine without causing it to seize. This careful approach revealed the profound, long-term biological impact of systematic starvation. The damage was not merely superficial emaciation, but a deep dysfunction of the body's core processes. Training on these evolving protocols was rushed to military medical units and aid organizations to prevent well-intentioned harm. The immediate instinct to give a starving person a full meal was precisely the wrong action. Saving lives required more than food. It demanded specialized knowledge, staged caloric increases, electrolyte monitoring, and meticulous care. The refeeding process became a critical lesson in the principles of cautious humanitarian intervention. It demonstrated that aid, however well-meaning, must be scientifically informed to be truly beneficial. This medical reality also shaped what soldiers chose to record and how they explained it to others. Following the camp liberations, American forces implemented a deliberate policy of forcing local German civilians to confront the evidence of the atrocities. The aim was to shatter the widespread claim of ignorance that so many German citizens presented when questioned about the camps. The policy sought to impose a public accountability that matched the scale of the crimes. At Buchenwald, this involved marching approximately 1,000 residents from the nearby cultural center of Weimar through the camp under armed guard. These civilians were made to walk past the piles of emaciated corpses, the mass graves, and the surviving prisoners who resembled skeletons. The proximity of this horror to their daily lives made their professed ignorance implausible. The reactions of these civilians were meticulously documented by soldiers and war correspondents. Their responses varied widely. Some expressed genuine shock and horror, their faces revealing a dawning comprehension of the reality that had existed just miles from their homes. Others maintained a stubborn defiance, continuing to claim they had known nothing of the camp's true purpose. Still others responded with visible discomfort or attempts to look away, which soldiers often interpreted as a sign of suppressed guilt or complicity. This documentation served a dual purpose. It provided immediate psychological insight into the German populace's awareness, and it created an invaluable evidentiary record. Film footage and photographs of these forced tours captured not just the atrocities themselves, but the reactions of ordinary Germans to them. These forced tours were a foundational component of the Allies' broader denazification strategy. The goal was to dismantle the ideological foundations of the Nazi regime by forcing a direct confrontation with its most brutal consequences. By making the local population witness the gruesome reality, the policy aimed to break the silence and complicity that had allowed the system to function. It was an attempt to inoculate German society against future extremist ideologies by ensuring an indelible memory of the horrors they produced. The presence of international media during many of these tours amplified this effect, broadcasting images of German civilians facing the evidence to a global audience. The process also functioned as a critical act of evidence preservation for the upcoming war crimes trials. The documented reactions of the civilians, their claims of ignorance juxtaposed with the overwhelming physical evidence of the camp, helped to establish a context of widespread societal knowledge. This visual and testimonial record was intended to preempt future denialism by creating an archive of immediate, first-hand witness accounts from the very people who lived in the shadow of the camps. The policy exposed the deep societal complicity that extended far beyond the SS guards and camp administrators. It demonstrated that the apparatus of the Holocaust relied not only on active perpetrators, but also on the passive acceptance and willful blindness of the surrounding community. This direct confrontation was a painful but necessary step in the long and difficult process of rebuilding a German society based on truth and accountability. The United States Army Signal Corps, alongside journalists and war crimes investigators, initiated an effort of unprecedented scale. Their mission was not simply to record events, but to construct an irrefutable archive of evidence. Acting on General Eisenhower's direct orders, photographers and filmmakers embedded with the units meticulously documented every detail of the liberated camps. They captured vast piles of personal belongings left behind by the victims, mountains of shoes, suitcases, eyeglasses, and human hair shorn from the prisoners. These objects served as powerful, silent testimony to the immense scale of the genocide. Each item represented an individual life, a visual catalogue of loss that numbers alone could not convey. This documentation was a deliberate strategy to counter any future attempts to deny or minimize the atrocities. The footage captured by these teams was processed with extreme urgency. It was rushed to newsreel producers for global distribution. These films were not merely informational. They were instrumental in shaping public opinion and solidifying the moral justification for the war. They showed audiences worldwide the harsh reality that had only been hinted at in earlier reports. This visual evidence aimed to remove any lingering ambiguity about the nature of the Nazi regime. Simultaneously, soldiers and investigators systematically collected survivor testimonies, often working through translators. They carefully recorded the victims' accounts, creating a foundational legal archive for the war crimes trials that were already being planned. These statements personalized the statistics, providing the narrative behind the physical evidence. This curated body of evidence became the visual and testimonial foundation for the prosecution cases at the Nuremberg trials and other subsequent proceedings. The photographs and films were presented in the courtroom to illustrate the systematic nature and sheer scale of the crimes. They provided irrefutable proof that moved the horrors from anecdotal accounts to documented, systematic fact. The evidence was also used for internal military education. General Eisenhower ensured that members of Congress and prominent newspaper editors were flown to Europe to witness the camps firsthand. This was a calculated move to create a core of influential witnesses who could counter any future disbelief. The goal was to ensure that soldiers, politicians, and the public understood the true moral stakes of the conflict they had just fought. For the Signal Corps photographers tasked with this grim work, the act of documentation was psychologically complex. They were trained to be impartial observers, yet they were witnessing scenes of profound human suffering. Sergeant William A. Scott III of the 183rd Combat Engineer Battalion described his initial reaction upon entering a camp, noting that the empty barracks seemed orderly, leading him to think, "Well, this ain't so bad." That perception shattered instantly when he encountered the emaciated survivors. He later reflected on the inadequacy of language, stating, "There's no way you can describe it." This sentiment was common among the documentarians. The camera lens provided a necessary barrier, a professional focus that allowed them to function amidst the horror. For some, the very act of documenting, of ensuring the truth was captured, became a form of psychological coping mechanism. It transformed their role from passive witnesses to active agents of justice. They were creating the record that would hold the perpetrators accountable, a process that offered a sense of purpose amid the overwhelming despair. This systematic recording was a final, crucial act of the liberation, ensuring that the crimes could never be plausibly denied. The liberation of the camps inflicted a profound and lasting psychological toll on the American soldiers who bore witness. These men, hardened by combat, encountered a form of horror that existed outside the scope of military training. The trauma manifested in nightmares, persistent guilt over their own survival, and a deep-seated anger toward the German civilians who lived in proximity to the atrocities. For many, the emotional burden remained with them for the rest of their lives, an unseen wound carried home from the war. Military chaplains provided what initial counseling they could, offering a limited form of spiritual solace in the immediate aftermath. Yet long-term psychological support was virtually non-existent in that era. The military at the camps held only political prisoners or hardened criminals. The systematic destruction of the most vulnerable members of society deepened the soldiers' sense of moral outrage and personal devastation. First-hand accounts frequently describe soldiers physically vomiting or breaking down emotionally during their initial inspections of the camps. Their reactions were visceral, a physiological and psychological response to an overwhelming reality. Sergeant Leon Bass, an intelligence reconnaissance sergeant, described his encounter at Buchenwald as a confrontation with walking dead people. He recalled his profound shock, stating, "I just looked at this in amazement and I said to myself, you know, my God, who are these people? What was their crime? You know? It's hard for me to try to understand why anyone could have been treated this way." At just 20 years old, he had no frame of reference for such suffering. The weight of these experiences did not fade in peacetime. Later, oral histories and interviews recorded decades after the war reveal how durable the trauma remained. Approximately 40% of Liberator witnesses broke down during such interviews, an indicator of how close to the surface those memories still lived. This emotional burden became a largely private matter in the post-war era. The cultural focus was on victory and rebuilding, not on the psychological struggles of the liberators. Many veterans found it difficult to discuss their experiences, and the language of post-traumatic stress was not yet part of the public discourse. They carried the memories in silence. The trauma, however, did not only manifest as a burden. For some veterans, it became a catalyst for a lifelong commitment to human rights and justice. Sergeant Benjamin Ferencz, who investigated mass graves as a war crimes investigator, channeled his experience into becoming a key prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. His work, and that of others like him, was driven by the indelible impact of what they had witnessed. Their advocacy was a direct legacy of the liberation. The psychological toll extended beyond the infantrymen to the medical personnel tasked with the rescue. Lieutenant Marie Knowles Ellifritz, a U.S. Army nurse, described the emotional toll of tending to survivors as beyond belief. She noted that, as Americans and as women, we never before had been subjected to such inhumanity to man. The challenge of managing thousands of critically ill patients in overwhelmed hospitals, beginning with the grim task of distinguishing the living from the dead, imposed its own unique strain. These experiences forced commanders and policymakers to consider what moral obligations exist alongside military objectives. The establishment of the War Refugee Board in January 1944 represented a profound, if belated, shift in American policy. It marked a formal pivot away from the bureaucratic inertia that had characterized the early war years toward an active, government-directed effort to rescue victims of Nazi persecution. Its creation was precipitated by a critical internal report that revealed the State Department had not merely been slow to act, but had actively obstructed efforts to grant visas and provide aid to Jewish refugees. This revelation forced a reckoning within the Roosevelt administration, leading to the creation of a body with a singular, urgent mission to save the remaining targeted populations of Europe during the final year of the war. The board's efforts were a testament to what determined action could achieve, even under severe time constraints. Through complex diplomatic pressure, it successfully persuaded neutral nations like Sweden and Switzerland to offer asylum to thousands of Hungarian Jews. It funded relief operations through organizations like the Red Cross and provided falsified identification papers to protect potential victims. It is estimated that the WRB's actions contributed directly to saving tens of thousands of lives. Its operations demonstrated that, even amidst a global war, targeted humanitarian intervention was possible. Yet the board's very existence was a stark reminder of a catastrophic failure. It was created in 1944 after the majority of the Holocaust's victims had already been murdered in the killing centers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. Its mission was to rescue the survivors, a remnant of the vast communities that had existed before the war. This timing underscored the tragic cost of the years of delay, skepticism, and bureaucratic obstruction that had preceded it. The WRB's successes, while significant, operated in the shadow of a genocide that was largely complete. The board also faced significant internal opposition from officials who continued to argue that any diversion of resources or attention from the singular goal of military victory was unacceptable. This opposition highlighted the persistent tension between strategic imperatives and moral obligations. The WRB's archives reveal a constant struggle against these bureaucratic hurdles, a fight to prioritize rescue within a wartime government still resistant to such commitments. Its leaders had to navigate a labyrinth of regulations and competing priorities to achieve even its limited objectives. The legacy of the War Refugee Board is complex. Its limited success framed the intense post-war policy debates on human rights and the responsibilities of powerful nations. It provided a concrete, if imperfect, model for how governmental power could be harnessed for large-scale humanitarian intervention. The board's proactive approach to rescue and relief, its use of diplomacy and funding, laid crucial groundwork for the establishment of future international bodies like the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The story of the WRB is ultimately a lesson in the consequences of inaction. It stands as a testament to the lives that could be saved when political will was finally mustered, and a haunting indictment of the millions who were lost while that will was absent. Its operations demonstrated that humanitarian intervention required not just compassion, but a dedicated bureaucratic apparatus willing to overcome institutional resistance. The evidence it helped compile and the precedents it set would directly inform the legal and moral arguments presented at the war crimes trials in Nuremberg. The evidence gathered by American troops during the liberation of the camps became the foundational material for the prosecution at the Nuremberg trials. The photographs and films taken by the Signal Corps, the survivor testimonies meticulously recorded by soldiers and translators, and the physical artifacts collected from the camps were presented not as secondary information, but as central proof of the charges. This documentation provided the tangible, visual reality that legal arguments alone could not convey. Images of emaciated survivors, piles of personal belongings, and the machinery of crematoria served as stark, irrefutable evidence of systematic murder. Prosecutors used this record to illustrate scale and method, moving horror from accusation to documented fact. This body of evidence helped crystallize new categories of international law. The concept of crimes against humanity and the legal definition of genocide took concrete form through material from Buchenwald, Dachau, and other sites. The term genocide itself had been coined by jurist Raphael Lemkin in 1944, and Nuremberg's evidentiary record gave that idea legal traction. The evidence demonstrated that these were not traditional violations between armies. They were crimes by state apparatus against civilian populations, requiring a new framework. Meticulous records showed premeditation and bureaucratic design, crucial for proving crimes against humanity and the broader criminal enterprise. A critical outcome of this approach was the personalization of guilt. The trials focused on individual criminal responsibility, Nazi leaders, military commanders, and industrialists, rather than collective punishment of the German people. Detailed documentation allowed prosecutors to connect policies and orders to tangible results in the camps. The proceedings established that obedience to orders was not a defense for participation in atrocities. This focus on individual accountability rested on a mountain of linked evidence, tying decisions to outcomes. American legal teams, led by Chief Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson, worked to ensure the process set a durable precedent for international justice. The legitimacy of the trials depended on a scrupulously fair procedure and an overwhelming presentation of facts. The camp evidence provided moral and factual weight for this unprecedented undertaking. The intent was to build a record able to withstand future challenges and guide the prosecution of mass atrocity. Beyond the courtroom, the same films and photographs reached global audiences through newsreels, shaping public understanding of the crimes. The outcomes at Nuremberg, built on liberation evidence, helped define modern international criminal law and influenced later tribunals. The legal reckoning did not close the chapter, however. While proof anchored accountability, the survivors still faced an uncertain future that would demand organization, resources, and time. The liberation of the camps marked the end of one ordeal and the beginning of another. For the survivors, the immediate challenge was one of sheer survival in a world left in ruins. Stripped of their homes, possessions, and families, they faced the monumental task of rebuilding lives from nothing. The United States Army, finding itself the de facto governing authority in vast sections of occupied Germany, assumed immediate responsibility. To address the immense humanitarian crisis, the military administration established a network of displaced persons camps. These facilities served as emergency shelters, providing the most basic necessities: protection from the elements, food, medical care, and a measure of security. The transition from prisoner to DP was a profound shift in status, yet the journey toward a normal life had only just begun. These DP camps quickly evolved into complex temporary communities. They became hubs of activity where survivors from diverse backgrounds lived together, awaiting resettlement to new countries or the rare possibility of returning to their old homes. The U.S. Army administered the camps, handling logistics, security, and distribution of supplies. They were assisted by a constellation of humanitarian organizations, including the Red Cross, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, and UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. Together, they worked to create a semblance of order and stability. The camps developed internal structures, with survivors establishing schools, organizing cultural events, and printing newspapers. This self-governance was a crucial step in reclaiming agency and dignity after years of systematic dehumanization. The challenges were immense and multifaceted. One of the most pressing and heartbreaking tasks was the effort to reunite families torn apart by war and genocide. Survivors posted lists of names on bulletin boards, searching for any trace of loved ones. International tracing services worked to connect people across different zones of occupation, but for many, the searches ended in confirmation of loss. Addressing long-term health needs was another persistent struggle. The survivors carried the physical and psychological scars of imprisonment. The effects of prolonged starvation, disease, and trauma required ongoing medical and psychological care that often stretched the limited resources available. Even as relief systems expanded, resettlement moved slowly. Restrictive immigration quotas in many nations, including the United States, constrained legal entry and delayed departures. As a result, large numbers of survivors remained in DP camps for years, forming a stateless population living in extended limbo. The DP period highlighted the tension between urgent human need and the policy constraints of the post-war order. This phase marked the fragile beginning of a long journey to normalcy. The DP camps were a paradox, sites of refuge and recovery, yet also constant reminders of loss and displacement. They symbolized the difficult transition from rescue to sustained support. For the American authorities and their partners, the establishment and administration of the DP camps represented an acceptance of continuing responsibility. The mission extended beyond liberation to the work of rebuilding lives. What emerged from these settlements? Systems of care, networks of testimony, and a renewed insistence on rights would inform a broader reckoning with power and duty in the years that followed. The American role in the final months of the Second World War underwent a profound transformation. The soldiers who entered the camps as military liberators quickly assumed a new critical function as evidence custodians. Their mission expanded beyond securing territory to meticulously documenting the crimes they discovered. This shift from combat to witnessing established a precedent that would resonate for decades. The overwhelming evidence gathered at Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, and Dachau became foundational for the Nuremberg trials, where the legal concept of genocide was formally applied. This process underscored a new understanding of international justice, one that held individuals accountable for crimes against humanity. This legacy directly influenced the development of U.S. foreign policy in the post-war era. The experience of confronting the Holocaust's systematic brutality shaped a growing American commitment to human rights and genocide prevention as components of its global engagement. The lessons from the failure to act on early warnings and the imperative demonstrated by the liberators informed responses to later humanitarian crises. The principle of "never again" became a rhetorical touchstone, though its application in practice often collided with tensions between strategic interests and moral obligations that had characterized the war years. The American experience highlighted the unique responsibilities that fall to powerful nations in confronting atrocity. Veterans groups and survivors worked to preserve the memory of the camps through education and memorialization. Their efforts ensured that the liberation narrative remained a powerful tool against the rise of Holocaust denial. The photographs, films, and testimonies collected by the troops provided an irrefutable archive that continues to serve as a bulwark against distortion. This narrative also functions as a cautionary account of the human cost of delayed action and bureaucratic indifference. The years of ignored intelligence and debated priorities stand as a stark lesson in the consequences of failing to translate knowledge into decisive intervention. The history of the liberation continues to shape modern military ethics and international humanitarian law. The legal precedents set at Nuremberg, built on the record assembled by the liberators, created the architecture for holding perpetrators of mass atrocities accountable. This legacy challenges contemporary audiences to consider their roles when confronted with evidence of systematic cruelty. The liberation arc demonstrates the enduring necessity of witness. It argues that seeing is not enough. Documentation is not enough. Reckoning requires a commitment to action, to justice, and to the preservation of memory. The obligation that fell upon those soldiers in 1945 extends forward, a continuing challenge to complacency and a reminder of the moral weight of power. The proof they secured still speaks with authority, and it frames the measure by which moral responsibility in warfare is judged. The American liberation of the Nazi camps marked a pivotal moment that redefined moral responsibility in warfare. The first-hand encounters with Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, and Dachau forced a confrontation with an industrial system of death. This experience transformed soldiers into witnesses and evidence custodians, a role crucial for the subsequent legal reckoning. It established the principle that knowledge alone is insufficient. General Eisenhower articulated this shift, stating that seeing the camps meant soldiers knew what they were fighting against. Their records endure as the backbone of our historical understanding. If this exploration has resonated, consider subscribing to join us as we examine more essential histories that challenge how we see the past. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time. Keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth.